which brings us to the statement on the For Women Scotland Supreme Court ruling. Minister for Women and Equalities, Bridget Phillipson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With permission, I will now make a statement to update the House on the Supreme Court judgment in the case for Women Scotland Limited versus the Scottish Ministers. This ruling brings welcome clarity and confidence for women and service providers. Single-sex spaces must be protected. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is personal to me. Before I was elected to this place, I ran a women's refuge in the North East for women and children fleeing domestic violence. I know how important it is, and always was to survivors, to have single-sex spaces based on biology, places of safety after trauma, time in a sanctuary which allowed them therapeutic support, healing from unimaginable male violence and fear. I remember, Madam Deputy Speaker, how hard countless campaigners had to fight over many decades to get any single-sex provision at all, to create women's refuges and to create rape crisis centres. And then later I remember how hard it was to convince commissioners that young homeless women trying to heal from terrifying acts of cruelty shouldn't be left in mixed-sex accommodation. I will continue to fight for that provision to ensure that women's safety, women's privacy and women's dignity is always protected. This government will continue as before, working to protect single-sex spaces based on biological sex, now with the added clarity of this ruling. And we will continue our wider work with commitment, with compassion, to protect all of those who need it right across society. Because, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a government that will support the rights of women and trans people now and always. This is a government that will support the rights of all people with protected characteristics now and always. This is a government that will support the rights of our most vulnerable now and always. And on that, Madam Deputy Speaker, there is no change to announce. Dignity and respect for all now and always. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a judgment long in the making. It began in 2018 when Scottish ministers issued guidance on the definition of a woman in the eyes of the Gender Representation on Public Boards Act. That guidance stated that a woman in that Act bears the same meaning as a woman in the Equality Act 2010 and included trans women with a gender recognition certificate. For Women Scotland challenged this guidance, saying that sex in the Equality Act means biological sex, so that a trans woman with a gender recognition certificate is a man for the purposes of the Act. The case was appealed to the Supreme Court, and last week the court ruled that sex in the Equality Act means biological sex. This means that a person will be considered as their biological sex for the purposes of the Equality Act, regardless of whether or not they have a gender recognition certificate. I know that the women who brought this challenge have not always been treated with the respect that they deserve. And this government believes in freedom of speech, and we believe in the fundamental right to protest. But in no way does that extend to criminal damage. There can be no excuse for defaced statues of feminist icons, no excuse for threats, no excuse for harassment. Madam Deputy Speaker, such acts seek to drag down the debate away from common sense, away from the sensible view held by the majority of the British public that women need single-sex spaces, that those spaces should be protected, and that you can protect those spaces while treating trans people with respect as well. So the certainty that this judgment brings is welcome. And now, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is time to move forward. There's now a need to ensure that this ruling is clear across a range of settings, from healthcare and prisons to sport and single-sex support groups. The Equality and Human Rights Commission, as Britain's equality regulator, is working quickly to issue an updated statutory code of practice to reflect this judgment, and I look forward to reviewing that code of practice in due course. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, alongside these updates, our work to protect single-sex spaces across society continues in earnest. Because for far too long, under the Conservative government, single-sex spaces were anything but, and nowhere is that clearer than in our hospitals. Year after year, the party opposite pledged to close mixed-sex wards and yet year after year their use not only persisted, it grew massively. And year after year, often in their most vulnerable moments, women were denied the privacy and the dignity that they deserved. Time after time, Conservative ministers, including the now leader of the opposition, came to this House and toured television studios telling the public that they were protecting single-sex spaces in our hospitals. Madam Deputy Speaker, the truth was very, very different, because as last year's data tells us, the use of mixed-sex wards rose by over 2,200%, 2,200% in 10 years under the last Tory government. There is no better example of this, of rhetoric divorced from reality, of a party playing politics with the safety of women, and we will never let them forget it. Madam Deputy Speaker, by contrast, this government will protect women's wards, and NHS England will soon publish guidance on how trans patients should be accommodated in clinical settings, and we will end the practice of mixed-sex wards once and for all. It is not just in our NHS that we will act on behalf of women. In prisons, we will continue to protect women's safety with single-sex accommodation. In women's sport, I've always backed integrity and fairness. Biology matters for competitive sport, and sporting bodies have issued rules to reflect this. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, in our prisons, in our hospitals, in sport, in a whole host of other spaces, what was true before the ruling remains true after the ruling. This government protects safe spaces for women under the Equality Act 2010. And for too many years, we've seen the heat dialed up on this debate by the party opposite, with no real action to protect women's spaces. While the use of mixed-sex wards increased under their watch, while an epidemic of violence against women and girls spread across the country, while women's health was neglected, this Labour government will deliver for women through our plan for change, driving down waiting lists month after month, tackling misogyny throughout society, and once and for all, delivering justice for survivors of violence against women and girls. Madam Deputy Speaker, I know as well that many trans people will be worried in the wake of the Supreme Court ruling. So I want to provide reassurance here and now that trans people will continue to be protected. We will deliver a full trans-inclusive ban on conversion practices. We will work to equalise all existing strands of hate crime. And we will review adult gender identity services so that all trans people get the high-quality care that they deserve. The laws to protect trans people from discrimination and harassment will remain in place, and trans people will still be protected on the basis of gender reassignment, a protected characteristic written into Labour's Equality Act. Madam Deputy Speaker, this government will offer trans people the dignity that too often they were denied by the party opposite. Too often, a convenient punch bag. Too often, the butt of jokes made in this place by the party opposite, culminating rather shamefully in the previous Prime Minister standing at this dispatch box trying to score cheap laughs from his backbenchers at the expense of vulnerable people. By contrast, Madam Deputy Speaker, this government is clear. Trans people deserve safety, they deserve opportunity, and they deserve respect. Madam Deputy Speaker, this verdict is about clarity and coherence in the eyes of the law. But the Supreme Court judges delivered, along with that verdict, a vital reminder. This isn't about the triumph of one group at the expense of another. It's not about winners or losers. It's not about us or them. And that is the message that I want to reinforce here today in this House. Everyone in our society deserves dignity and respect. Those values are not and never will be a zero-sum battle. Dignity and respect for all. Those are the values that lift us up and set us free. Those are the values that define and distinguish any modern and compassionate society. And those are the values, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this government will do everything to promote and protect now and always. And I commend this statement to the House.
Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of her statement, even if it was mostly a shameless work of fiction. I could not believe my eyes or my ears this afternoon. In 2021, the Prime Minister said it is not right to say only women have a cervix. In 2022, he said it is the law that trans women are women. In 2023, he said, and I quote, 99% of women don't have a penis. I know what a woman is, and I always have. The people of this country know what a woman is. We didn't need the Supreme Court to tell us that, but this government did. A Labour government so desperate to jump on a bandwagon that they abandoned common sense, along with the SNP, who put rapists in women's prisons, and, of course, the Liberal Democrats. The Supreme Court ruling is a powerful victory for the determined women behind For Women Scotland and for people all over the UK who know how important it is to give privacy and dignity to women and girls who need it. But it follows years of battle. Individual women took action to uphold the law at great personal cost, losing their jobs and their reputations. A few weeks ago, I met the Darlington nurses who have been forced to bring legal action after a male nurse started using their changing room. Even their union, the Royal College of Nursing, refused to represent them. Women should not have to battle the NHS or their employers through the courts. Why has it been such a battle? Because something as simple as biological reality became politicised and corrupted by activists pushing this ideology as foolish politicians cheered. Even the Secretary of State, who said that this is personal to her, stated just last year that men should access women's spaces. Whether it is female victims in our courts being forced to refer to their male sex attackers as she, or the NHS using confusing gender-neutral language, putting the health of women at risk, this is a serious matter. At every point, we have fought for women. We faced hostility from activist groups and those opposite. In 2020, when we rejected Labour's calls to introduce self-ID, or in 2021, when the then Home Secretary, the member for Whittam, ordered police forces to stop recording offences by trans women in female crime statistics. The current Culture Secretary said that crimes committed by men should be recorded how they wish, that those convicted of serious sexual offences should be held in jails that match their chosen gender. It was crazy then, and it is crazy now. I spent years battling abuse from Labour MPs as I fought to uphold biological sex in government, and as I blocked the SNP introducing their mad self-identity laws. I will take no lectures from them on what to do on this issue. Women and gay rights groups like the LGB Alliance were even refused stands at the Labour Party conference. The idea that they have supported this all along is for the birds. The Foreign Secretary described opponents of self-ID as dinosaurs. Labour now says that they know what a woman is and that transgender people should use services and facilities designated to their biological sex. They've never said this before. This is a U-turn, but we welcome it. Now that we have legal clarity, will the Prime Minister show some courage and do the right thing? Will he apologise to the member for Canterbury, who faced so many security concerns as she was hounded out by the Labour Party and was rebuked by the Prime Minister and many Labour MPs sitting there looking at me for stating what the Supreme Court has now ruled to be true? Will she apologise to the member for Canterbury? I doubt it. Will the Prime Minister crack down on the groups we saw defacing statues of suffragists over the weekend with the same energy he reserves for his political opponents? Or will we see more two-tier justice? Because the last time we saw Labour MPs standing next to them with no rebuke whatsoever. Will the Secretary of State ensure that the EHRC has the government's full support in its enforcement of the Code of Practice? And in particular, will she condemn those Labour ministers who described Baroness Faulkner's entirely correct position on the judgment as appalling? Madam Deputy Speaker, we need to root out gender ideology from our institutions. This government now has a serious job to do, as many organisations will still fail women. So I ask the following. As Minister for Women and Equalities, I published guidance for schools that made clear that toilets and changing rooms must be provided separately for girls and boys. She scrapped that guidance. Will she stand up to the unions and urgently publish what she now admits is the law? She also scrapped RHSE guidance to prevent schools from teaching contested gender ideology as fact. Will she now publish this guidance and remove materials that misstate the law? Will she act to stop passports and licences being issued with self-declared rather than legal sex? Will the government support our amendments to the data bill to ensure digital ID systems record biological sex accurately? And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I heard the Secretary of State. She says that she is here to protect transgender people. Many of them were misled by Labour's misstatements on this issue. Some are now left very anxious. She has not provided any reassurance, and she should not use them as a shield to protect her failure. This isn't the end of the matter, but the beginning of the end. There is so much to do, and the Conservative Party, under my leadership, will be relentless in ensuring the government does the right thing.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm delighted to see the Right Honourable Lady in her place today. Many would run from a record like hers on these matters, but not the Right Honourable Lady. She and the party opposite had 14 years to provide clarity on the issues they now claim to take an interest in. And the Supreme Court confirmed that Labour's Equality Act is the basis for single-sex spaces and protection. But they didn't, Madam Deputy Speaker, they didn't provide that clarity. But before I turn and say a bit more about the Right Honourable Lady's record, I'll say a little bit more about mine. I will come to the questions. If the Right Honourable Lady would have some patience, I will respond to her questions. Madam Deputy Speaker, I have supported countless women and children fleeing appalling male violence, sexual violence and domestic abuse. I have campaigned for decades on women's rights. I know more than most the importance of spaces for women. I fought for them, I delivered them, I ran them. And during my time running that refuge, while Labour was delivering the groundbreaking Equality Act, which this ruling confirms sets in law the basis for single-sex spaces, what was the Leader of the Opposition doing? She was busy hacking the website of the leading architect of the Equality Act, forever the keyboard warrior. And she's learned nothing from her party's crushing electoral defeat last year. She held the post of Minister for Women and Equalities for 2 years and did precisely nothing, provided no clarity in the law and nothing to improve the lives of women, which got materially worse on her watch. She comes here claiming to speak for women, but let's look at her record and her party's record. An increase in stalking offences, prosecutions and convictions for domestic abuse nearly halved since 2015. The rape charge rate at a record low. Survivors of sexual violence waiting years for justice. A 2,000% increase in the use of mixed-sex wards in over 10 years. That is their record, Madam Deputy Speaker. And in terms of the questions that she asks about the Equality and Human Rights Commission and their statutory code of conduct, their statutory code of practice. I have set out that I'm expecting an updated version of that as quickly as is possible. I will work with the Equality and Human Rights Commission to implement that code of practice to make sure that everyone has the clarity that they require, and I expect the EHRC to work quickly and thoroughly on this matter. Madam Deputy Speaker, she asks about gender questioning guidance and she asks about RSHE guidance. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm afraid that's just another area that is simply laughable. Merely months before the election was called, they published a version of the draft guidance for gender questioning children. And since that time, we had the final review published by Dr. Hilary Cass. It is right that we ensure that that guidance aligns with Dr. Cass's final review. And on the RSHE guidance, that consultation concluded after the election. We couldn't be clearer, Madam Deputy Speaker. We will always protect single-sex spaces, and on this side of the House we are focused on delivering for women. While the Leader of the Opposition described maternity pay as excessive and called the minimum wage harmful, We are improving protections for pregnant women at work. We are ensuring that women can take maternity leave and come back to good, secure jobs. We are expanding childcare. The first 750 new free breakfast clubs open today. We've brought forward the single biggest piece of child protection legislation in a generation to protect young women and girls. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, it was Labour's groundbreaking Equality Act that provides the basis for single-sex spaces for biological women that has been set out today. This Labour government has a plan for change, a plan that will deliver for women. It's time for her party to get offline and get on board.
Chair of the Women and Equalities Committee, Sarah Owen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Far from this ruling providing clarity, trans, intersex and non-binary people are instead anxious and unsure about where this ruling leaves them, legally and practically, as they go about their lives. Does the Minister recognise that this ruling was made without a single contribution from trans people themselves? And will she ensure trans, intersex and non-binary people will be involved in any upcoming new guidance, and if so, how?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I do believe this ruling provides much-needed clarity. I do recognise the Chair of the Select Committee's concern in ensuring that all people are treated with dignity and respect, including trans people. And my expectation is that through the development of the Code of Practice and the guidance, the EHRC will engage with a range of stakeholders with a range of different views as they develop that work and set it out in full.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of her statement. I, of course, respect the independence of the Supreme Court and the ruling it has made to interpret the law as it stands, as I do the concerns of many women and the fears, the now increased fears, of the LGBT community. I also respect what the Secretary of State had to say about her experience of working in a refuge. And I agree, there is no length that we shouldn't go to ensure protection for women in that situation. But I'm sure from what she said, the Secretary of State will agree with me that that shouldn't be at the cost of the human rights and the security of another vulnerable group in society, which is what this threatens to do. And I would ask her if she could explain where now those transgender people who are fleeing violence, where they can go for refuge if they are going to be completely excluded. For years, we've seen this intolerable debate where two vulnerable groups have been pitted against each other, two vulnerable groups afraid of the same thing, violence, and mostly from men. So now the challenge for this government is to live up to the spirit of perhaps one of its proudest achievements in its previous government, the Equality Act, in protecting everyone. And I would ask the Minister, does she think it would be acceptable, if this government is not able to do that, that we see trans women forced into men's toilets to face goodness knows what sort of aggression, potentially violence there? And I would ask her if she would confirm what she says about protecting trans rights, because this government, we need some leadership from them now. And I've written to the Minister and asked her if we're going to see legislation to do that. Because we must remember that what we're dealing with here is not some hypothetical, it's real lives, real fears, real concerns amongst the LGBT community. Because equality and human rights should never be the...
Order. Minister.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. As she says, I know that she has written to me on this topic. I would be happy to meet with her, or a member of the Ministerial team would be happy to meet with her to discuss this further. Where we can agree is that dignity and respect should be for all within our country. That is for women and for trans people too. And trans people should not face discrimination or harassment on the basis of who they are. But I believe it is entirely compatible to ensure that we have a society that treats everyone with dignity and respect, whilst ensuring that single-sex spaces can continue to exist for biological women who require that safety and dignity, particularly following periods of terrible abuse. And I think it is also important that, of course, there are services that are available for trans people in addition. And often it's the case that some of those services are much better provided by those with the specialist knowledge and expertise in order to deliver that provision. I agree this should not be seen as being a conflict. And the ruling from the Supreme Court, whilst being clear about the importance of biological sex, was also at pains to stress that trans people do retain clear protections within law and should be able to live their lives free of harassment and discrimination.
Catherine Fookes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've already been contacted by several different LGBTQ+ and trans organisations in Monmouthshire, my constituency, who are really concerned and frightened about the potential implications of this judgment. Will the Minister commit to meeting with trans people from my constituency, such as Queer Space, Abergavenny Pride and Monmouth Pride, to hear their concerns about the potential impact of this ruling?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I do note my honourable friend's concern, and I can assure her that I will continue to meet with a range of stakeholders in this important area, because I agree with her that no one should face prejudice or discrimination because of who they are, and that's why we're working with the Home Office to deliver our commitment to equalise all existing strands of hate crime, to make them aggravated offences. We will work right across this House to ensure that whilst we maintain single-sex spaces for biological women, we ensure that trans people have the support and the respect that they deserve, including access to healthcare services.
Shivani Raja.
Will the Secretary of State confirm whether she will take action? Will she take action to ensure policies and lessons in schools are not led by external organisations that are captured by contested gender ideology?
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I set out in my response to the Leader of the Opposition, we will publish revised guidance where it comes to RSHE. I think it is an important principle that parents understand what is being taught to their children within their children's school, and we will ensure that that is maintained.
Emily Thornberry.
Very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Over the last few days, calls to switchboard the national LGBT+ helpline in my constituency has skyrocketed, with callers who are in fear for what this ruling means to them. Because trans people, frightened to use public loos today, know one thing. And does the Secretary of State agree? We should all be clear about this. The overwhelming threat to women and to all of the trans community is the violence that we suffer from cis men.
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I agree that male violence remains a very serious challenge that we face as a country, a challenge that this Labour government is determined to confront. But I would say to her that the ruling of the Supreme Court was clear about the importance of biological sex, but I would not want any trans person in her constituency or anywhere across the country to be fearful. I believe that everyone has the right to be treated with dignity and respect, not to face discrimination or harassment, and that is why we will back the police to ensure that action is taken against anyone who behaves in that way.
Dame Harriett Baldwin.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd be grateful if the Secretary of State could focus on her government and the future implications of this judgment. In her statement, she said NHS England will soon publish guidance on how trans patients should be accommodated in clinical settings. And if I can read to her what the Worcestershire Acute Hospital Trust has in its guidance currently, it says patients should always be treated as the gender they identify as, regardless of what their transition looks like or how long they have shared their identity with others. Patients should always be in an environment that aligns with their gender identity. Would she say to Worcestershire Acute Hospital Trust that they need to actually act very quickly to change that guidance?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, my colleagues and officials in the Department of Health and Social Care are in contact with NHS England to ensure that guidance is set out rapidly to give the clarity that is required arising out of the Supreme Court judgment. And if the Right Honourable Lady would share with me the details that she's just read out there, I would happily make sure that that is investigated further.
Preet, Gill.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the ruling from the Supreme Court and the Minister's statement. The Supreme Court has been clear that Sex and the Equality Act 2010 means biological sex. The question now turns to how we make sure that the Equality Act is properly understood and implemented. So can the Secretary of State state how she will ensure that public bodies, third sector organisations, sports bodies, regulated sectors and so on comply with the Act so women's safety, privacy and dignity is protected.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I said, we'll work with the EHRC to provide further guidance to service providers, including through their update to the Statutory Code of Practice. We expect the EHRC to do that as rapidly as possible, recognising that this is a thorough and detailed piece of work. But it is important that service providers arising from this ruling by the Supreme Court now have the clarity and confidence that was always there in the Equality Act 2010.
John Lamont.
Thank you very much. The Supreme Court's ruling goes a long way to guarantee the rights and safety of women and girls. But does the Minister agree with me that the judgment highlights why it's now right for the SNP government to finally ditch the divisive gender self-ID agenda once and for all, and proves it was totally wrong for Scottish Labour to back the SNP Gender Recognition Reform Bill?
My understanding, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that the Scottish Government do not intend to progress their gender recognition reforms. My officials will work with the EHRC, who will in turn also work with the Scottish Government. I believe Scottish ministers have indicated, Madam Deputy Speaker, that they wish to engage with the EHRC on this guidance, which is an important and welcome development.
Dame Meg Hillier.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm proud to represent a constituency which shows tolerance to people from all backgrounds, and unlike the political hot potato this has become in this place and in political dialogue. I have a constituent who has been transitioned in the 1970s. She's used female toilets now for more of her life than she ever did any other toilets. Are we saying that her dignity and her respect that the Secretary of State has talked about is going to be any way improved if there is any ban on her using the toilets that she's been using for so many years?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the ruling from the Supreme Court made clear that the provision of single-sex spaces is on the basis of biological sex. But what I would say to my right honourable friend and to her constituent is that through the development of the Code of Practice that the EHRC will be setting out, they will make sure that businesses and others ensure that there is dignity and respect for all, that there is appropriate provision, including the use of toilet facilities, so that no one, including trans people, must feel unsafe when they use public toilets.
Sarah Dyke.
Deputy Speaker, everyone must be able to access services with the dignity upheld and privacy respected, including women and trans people. But following the Supreme Court ruling, many people are feeling confused and concerned. We must not allow this to lead to further heated arguments and toxicity. So what steps is the Minister taking to develop the critical guidance needed to give businesses and public bodies clarity on how this ruling should be implemented so everyone is treated with the dignity that they deserve?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, we will work with the EHRC on that guidance. They will present a revised code of practice that I will review and will present in due course. It is important that they do that as quickly as possible, but as I say, this is a complex area that must be undertaken thoroughly, including engagement with a range of stakeholders, including businesses, for the reasons that the Honourable Lady identifies.
Charlotte Nichols.
This verdict raises as many questions as it answers, and indeed has been referred to by the civil servant Melanie Field, who oversaw the Equality Act's drafting and passage, as having, quote, significantly reinterpreted Parliament's intentions. These questions are primarily about what the purpose of a gender recognition certificate is now, whether exclusion from single-sex spaces is merely lawful or required, but also in protecting women's spaces, such as toilets, from predatory men pretending to be trans women. What exactly stops those same men from now accessing them, pretending to be trans men?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I understand the concern that my honourable friend expresses and why she raises the question she does today in this House. But I do have to say to her that the position of this government is that the Supreme Court has provided clarity and confidence in this area, particularly where it comes to single-sex spaces being on the basis of biological sex, and the basis for that was the Equality Act that the last Labour government introduced.
Caroline Johnson.
Madam Speaker, I am pleased to get the clarity from the Supreme Court judgment. People on this side have always known what a woman is. The Right Honourable Lady says she's going to ensure that the government implements and ensures that the public services are fully compliant with the legislation, which is good. Could she clarify, she's talked about NHS single-sex wards and their provision for biological females and biological males. Could she confirm, does that mean that trans women will be cared for on male wards?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the basis for NHS provision and the basis for single-sex services of all kinds will be on the basis of biological sex.
Marsha de Cordova.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I firstly welcome and thank the Secretary of State for the measured way which she has delivered this statement, but also for her robust work on this issue. Last week's landmark Supreme Court judgment not only provided clarity, but some long overdue common sense. For too long, the issue has at times been toxic and has caused a great deal of harm to both women and trans people. So can I ask the Secretary of State to confirm to the House that her department is liaising with the Equalities and Human Rights Commission to seek assurances that they will work not only at pace but also to set some clear timelines in relation to updating the statutory guidance, and will she also ensure that any guidance that is now unlawful is withdrawn?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I can give my honourable friend the assurance that we will work as quickly as possible with the EHRC in this important area. I also think she is right to highlight the importance of good temper where it comes to different views on this topic, recognising that people have held strongly held views over a number of years, but where we do that, we respect one another, and that where we disagree, we do not descend into hate-filled rhetoric or involve ourselves in some of the unfortunate and deeply regrettable protests in terms of the nature of the defacement of statues and hate-filled rhetoric. Now is the opportunity, Madam Deputy Speaker, arising from the Supreme Court judgment to draw a line under this, to make sure the right guidance is in place and to ensure that clarity is there for all.
Kirsty Blackman.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I appreciate the Secretary of State's words around reducing the temperature on this. There are an awful lot of people who are hurting a huge amount this week as a result of the announcement that's been made, and I appreciate the commitment to reduce the temperature on that, and I hope that everybody would sign up to that. The SNP welcomes the clarity that's been offered on the definition in the Equality Act and notes the judgment's points of interaction between the 2010 and the 2004 Act. Also notes the commitment of the Secretary of State and the EHRC to deliver the guidance as quickly as possible on the new Code of Practice. I would like to ask the Secretary of State if and when she'll be replying to the letter that was sent from the Scottish Government seeking a meeting with UK Government in early course, and I would urge her to undertake that meeting as soon as possible, please.
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I would of course be happy to engage with colleagues from the Scottish Government. I'll respond to that letter as quickly as I can.
Cat Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very conscious that I represent many trans, intersex and non-binary constituents, and that the representations that I've had made to me in my office over the past few days has been a very clear message that they're feeling particularly victimised and quite scared for their own safety. Some are trans women and some are trans men who seem to be very much lost from this debate. But the one thing that really unites them is that they're worried about their day-to-day safety. So can I ask the Minister to provide some assurance to trans people right across the country that the Equality Act is still there and can protect them from discrimination and harassment?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right. They retain protection from discrimination and harassment, and I can say very clearly to this House that trans people should not be treated, should not be victims of discrimination or harassment. They deserve dignity and respect, and that's why it is important that we also ensure that trans people have access to high-quality healthcare services, and that we also clamp down on hate crimes, including those that are targeted at LGBT people.
Harriett Cross.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Supreme Court's ruling and congratulate For Women Scotland and others who have campaigned tirelessly on this, despite the abuse, threats and attempts to silence them. Could the Minister please confirm what discussions either the Prime Minister or anyone on the front bench at the time had with Anna Sarwar, the Scottish Labour leader, when he whipped his MSPs to vote in favour of the SNP's Gender Recognition Reform Bill? And does the Labour front bench now regret some of their previous decisions where they have sided against women across the country, voicing their very real concerns?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, where I can agree with the Honourable Lady is that no one should face threats, intimidation or harassment for expressing their views. That is an important principle in our country around freedom of speech, but it should not cross a line. Where it comes to the approach that we take in Scotland, the leader of the Scottish Labour Party has indicated that he welcomes and supports the Supreme Court judgment.
Dawn Butler.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't know if anyone else in the House has butch lesbian friends and have been with them when they've been told to get out of women's toilets, but I have. And it is not pleasant and it's not nice. So those people that are using this as a political football, again, should be ashamed of themselves. Madam Deputy Speaker, people didn't understand. If you're saying that trans women have to use men's toilets, and as my honourable friend said, trans men then have to use women's toilets, how are you going to stop them? By asking to see their genitalia? It makes no sense. But does my honourable friend agree with me that the service providers for refugees who provide a vital service for women in desperate need and often use their discretion are now fearful that they can no longer use their discretion when providing services?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Supreme Court judgment set out that single-sex spaces are provided on the basis of biological sex, but I do recognise the concern that my honourable friend raises. Lesbians should not be treated in a discriminatory way, and we must ensure that there are toilets and facilities available for everyone within our country. So I just say to her that through the guidance that the EHRC will set out, there will be additional clarity provided in the areas that she has identified.
Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In some ways, the biggest question today is why it took a Supreme Court's decision to confirm this position in the Equalities Act. I've met with so many. I've heard so much regarding women who are considering to stand as candidates, who are reluctant to do so because of the toxicity in public life. And I think this debate is probably one of the most toxic in terms of misogyny going towards women. I'm lucky, I'm a man, I haven't experienced to the same extent nowhere near what women have experienced. But would she take this moment to reject and to stand up for all women who have campaigned on this issue, reject the abuse and hostility that's put towards them, the importance of their dignity and respect, and thank For Women Scotland for the work they've done taking this forward?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I do recognise the good intentions that the honourable gentleman has when he asks that question, but I tell him, like many women in this House, I've experienced that too, and we know what it's like as women to face that kind of abuse, and it is important that whilst we recognise that there can be no place for that kind of abuse of women in public life, we have a responsibility to change that culture, to change that climate, and to encourage women to come forward and stand for elected office.
Tonia Antoniazzi.
Madam Deputy Speaker, since I've been in this House, I have felt the force of the lobby which has made people and MPs across this House stand there and say that trans women are women. What happened last week was the Supreme Court said that sex in the Equality Act is actually biological sex. That I welcome, Madam Deputy Speaker. But what is the Secretary of State going to do to deal with the types of damage, or the damage that mermaids and Stonewall has caused for a generation? That's 14 years. Under a Tory government, what steps is she going to take to make sure that they rectify the damage they've done to a generation of trans and gender questioning children?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I recognise my honourable friend's long-standing interest and campaigning in this area. She is right that the Supreme Court judgment provides clarity in terms of biological sex. What I would also say to her where it comes to support for gender questioning children, Where we are talking about children and young people, this has to be about their well-being, because we are often talking about young people who are very vulnerable, who are experiencing real difficulties in their lives. And Hilary Cass's review made clear that young people in that situation do need support, do need protection, and that is why we will this year also publish revised gender questioning guidance for our schools as well, to provide that further clarity that is needed.
Vicky Slade.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd firstly like to ask the Secretary of State how we are all going to be asked to prove our birth sex, because, as the other honourable member said, this is not just about people who are transgender, non-binary and intersex, but also people who don't conform to gender stereotypes. And I need to share with you my constituents, one who told me, "It seems I am going to be ghettoised into trans spaces," and another who said, "This ruling sends a message that we do not belong, however much we contribute." So what does the Secretary of State suggest I say to those constituents, and will she join me and the honourable member for Bournemouth East in meeting Dorset's Space Youth Project for LGBT young people when they visit Parliament next week?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I would say to the honourable lady's constituents and trans people across this country that the ruling was clear that whilst single-sex spaces are on the basis of biological sex, trans people retain in the law protection from discrimination and harassment, and we as a government will always ensure that trans people have the dignity and respect that they deserve.
Nadia Whittam.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Research shows that half of trans people already fear using public toilets. So I am deeply, deeply concerned about the impact of comments by the Minister and the Prime Minister's spokesperson that trans people should use a toilet that many of them would not feel comfortable or safe in. So I ask, how would trans people's exclusion from toilets they have long used be a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim, as the Supreme Court judges and Equality Act dictates? And would the Minister like to clarify that there is nothing in law, in fact, which requires trans women to use men's toilets, or trans men to use women's toilets, or non-binary people to use one corresponding with the sex they were assigned at birth?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Supreme Court's judgment was clear on biological sex. But I do understand and recognise the need to ensure that there is provision, including toilet facilities and other provision in place for everyone within our society. That's why many businesses, many service providers also provide unisex provision, why many service providers will also put in place enclosed bathrooms that do not require people to make that decision, to ensure that their dignity and privacy is respected. That is important for all people in our country, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Luke Evans.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Practical question. Does the ruling apply retrospectively? So if anyone was to have lost their job for their views or won a title in sport, for example, does it apply retrospectively, yes or no?
Minister.
I think the honourable gentleman is referring to employment law cases, and I would have to defer to legal colleagues on that. What the judgment did, however, set out was that it was the Equality Act 2010 that is the basis for single-sex spaces being determined on the basis of biology. They determined that was always the case, had always been the case since 2010, and it was his party that failed to provide that clarity in 14 years.
Tan Singh Desi.
Very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The unanimous Supreme Court judgment has provided clarity about the application of the Equality Act 2010. And it is incredibly important that hard-earned women's rights and single-sex spaces are protected, while also protecting our trans community who continue to face considerable discrimination. So there needs to be a solution whereby they too are treated with dignity. Does my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, agree that this entire issue needs to be dealt with a great deal of sensitivity and sensibility, rather than it being treated as a political football or as a culture war issue?
Minister.
I agree that the Supreme Court judgment provides much needed clarity and certainty, including to service providers, but I also agree with my honourable friend that we need to make sure that this is dealt with sensitivity. I think particularly whereas we have done a number of exchanges in this House that we are talking about children who might be gender questioning, might be experiencing significant issues around their well-being. And I want to make sure that right across society, women have the access to single-sex spaces that they need and that they deserve and that, as he has said, they have long campaigned for, but the trans people too receive appropriate support, including healthcare support, and do not face discrimination or harassment on the basis of who they are.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
While the Supreme Court's ruling brings clarity to some, it brings undeniable fear and uncertainty to others. And the Minister's statement today still leaves vulnerable trans people lost in a maze of complex equalities law. She talks about dignity and respect. Take just one setting for which her government is responsible. Our prison system is dangerously dysfunctional. So what safeguards will now be strengthened so that no trans person is placed in greater danger as a direct result of this ruling?
I'm afraid to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, I disagree with the Honourable Lady that it was complex. I think the ruling was very straightforward and very clear and has provided clarity that has been sadly lacking for many years. To her question around prisons, of course it is important that vulnerable prisoners receive the support that they need, but the basis of single-sex spaces are determined, as the Supreme Court ruled, on the basis of biological sex. But of course, yes, where there are vulnerable prisoners, different situations may need to be put in place separate to that.
Chian Wara.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I am quite frankly astounded that the Leader of the Opposition seeks to portray herself as a champion of women's rights when she has refused to recognise the reality of discrimination and harassment of women and stripped the funding from so many of the services that protect women. And I would also like to pay tribute to the many members of this chamber who have worked publicly and privately to protect single-sex spaces and the rights and dignity of trans people. Now, the judgment clarifies that single-sex spaces do not have to offer services to trans women. Does my right honourable friend, can she say whether they are obliged to refuse services to single-sex women?
Minister.
Spaces that operate on a single-sex basis must do so on the basis of biological sex. But of course, providers are able to offer, should they choose, inclusive services, so long as they are clear about who they are offering their services to. And I agree with my honourable friend that what we saw under the last government was a shameful record where it comes to prosecution of rape, prosecution of domestic violence, where rape in this country was all but decriminalised.
Rebecca Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm sure the Secretary of State will recognise that there are many women, former supporters of her party, who voted for candidates like me entirely because of the record that we had for supporting biological women. However, in the meantime, given that a number of trade unions claim that they will ignore the ruling of the Supreme Court and in some cases even campaign against it, what plans does the government have to ensure that all trade unions are made to recognise that the Supreme Court ruling applies to them too?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't really know where the Honourable Lady's been since July, but her party suffered a devastating general election defeat. That's why she sat there and not over here.
Steve Brace.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Many of my trans, intersex and binary and non-binary residents next to and their relatives have been in touch with me to express their concern and fear after the decision last week. Can I know that the Secretary of State mentioned this in her opening statement, can she recommit, though, to the ambitious agenda that we do have to advance the dignity and respect of trans people over the course of this Parliament?
Minister.
I understand my honourable friend's concern, and what I would say to his constituents and to trans people across our country is that we are working with the Home Office to deliver our commitment to equalise all existing strands of hate crime to make them aggravated offences. We will also bring forward a draft conversion practices bill in line with the King's Speech and our manifesto that will be trans inclusive. We're clear that that ban must not cover legitimate psychological support, treatment or non-directive counselling, but we are clear that conversion practices are abuse and we will legislate to stop them.
Carla Denyer.
Mr. Speaker, many people are feeling deeply worried about the Supreme Court judgment and what it means for their ability to live their lives in dignity and in privacy. So will the Secretary of State make a commitment to uphold trans people's fundamental rights, including the right to privacy, given that the Gender Recognition Act was created in part to do that, but the Supreme Court ruling risks dismantling that by forcing trans people to out themselves multiple times a day whenever they visit the toilet, in their workplace, in public buildings, or indeed in the hospital?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm sorry, but I just disagree with the questions that the Honourable Lady poses. The ruling from the Supreme Court was clear that whilst single-sex spaces are to be delivered on the basis of biological sex, the judgment also set out that trans people must be free to live their lives free of discrimination and harassment and retain clear protections within law.
Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister will know there is considerable concern and fear amongst transgender, intersex and non-binary people across the UK, including in my constituency. But will the Minister outline what urgent steps the Government is taking to reassure my trans and non-binary constituents that their rights remain protected under UK law, and to ensure that this ruling is not misinterpreted or misused to undermine their dignity, safety and access to services, or lead to discrimination on a wide scale, including wrongly challenging people trying to go about their lives in our communities?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the rights of trans people are respected and retained following the Supreme Court judgment. The ruling was very clear about that, and it is important that we emphasise that point here today. Alongside that, Madam Deputy Speaker, we will ensure that hate crime is properly recorded and punished, because trans people and all people in our country deserve to live their lives free from discrimination, harassment and hate.
Gregory Stafford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Patients not only deserve to be treated in single-sex wards, but also be treated, especially when they're having intimate exams, by clinicians of the gender and sex that they wish. So is she concerned, as I am, about the General Medical Council that is going to carry on with its policy to remove and hide biological sex from the medical register? What discussions is she having with the General Medical Council and the other medical regulators about this issue?
Minister.
I agree that it is important that patients have the right to single-sex provision and to the access to single-sex provision around clinical treatment. But I'd just point out to the honourable gentleman that he might want to have a word with the Leader of the Opposition about the massive increase in the use of mixed-sex wards under his party.
Zara Sultana.
Deputy Speaker, in Britain today, trans women are denied safe housing, refused essential healthcare and left waiting years for gender-affirming treatment. This is not accidental. It is the result of a climate of hostility against a marginalised community fuelled by people in positions of power, including in this very chamber. So let me be clear, trans people are not a debate, a culture war or an ideology. They are human beings and trans rights are human rights. So I ask the Minister, will this government ensure that it doesn't pander to hate? Will it reverse its damaging rollback of LGBT+ rights, including the ban on puberty blockers, and unequivocally defend the Equality Act and the protections it provides for trans people across the UK?
Minister.
The Honourable Lady asked a number of questions there. What I can say to her is that trans people, of course, deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, and they retain rights to live their lives free of discrimination and harassment as set out in the Supreme Court judgment. She asks about puberty blockers. I'm afraid there is going to be no change to government policy in this important area.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now we've got confirmation from the Supreme Court what the definition of a woman is. Could the Secretary of State confirm that all public sector and private sector bodies will apply that definition with immediate effect?
Secretary of State. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Equality and Human Rights Commission will set out a statutory code of practice that will provide further clarity. But I would just say to the honourable gentleman that I'll take no lectures from his party about the importance of defending women's rights, given that one of his own number that sits on those benches was convicted and went to prison for assaulting his former partner.
Emily Darlington.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are some days I'm really proud to be an MP and the level of debate in this chamber, and there's some days like today when, quite frankly, the Leader of the Opposition was absolutely appalling. She continues to talk over people, not listen, laugh at people while they're talking about an issue that is very, very serious. People out there are scared as a result of this judgment, and they will... Could you maybe let me speak? Sorry, apologies. Sorry, could the honourable member allow me the politeness of not speaking over me?
Keep going.
My question, and I will ask a question, when...
Order. I do appreciate that feelings are running high in this statement. However, please do ask your question and put it on the record.
Do you think that, does the Secretary of State agree with me, the debate in this chamber is listened to by those people who are today scared, and the behaviour of the Leader of the Opposition in talking over people, laughing at people, and when cis men violence was mentioned, the opposite benches laughed. That does not reassure women or trans women in this country. Does she agree?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I agree that where we discuss these matters, they are sensitive and they do generate strong feelings. And it is, of course, right that in this House we are able to engage in robust discussion, including on issues that might at times be difficult. But I accept the point that my honourable friend is making, that we do need to treat one another with respect and understand the need. So much for dignity and respect, eh?
Rebecca Paul.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the clear ruling from the Supreme Court, and I thank the Secretary of State for her statement. However, I'm really disappointed that there was no mention of schools at all in her statement. Many schools are teaching gender ideology as if it is fact. They are not providing single-sex facilities and single-sex sports teams. How will she ensure that they now, going forwards, comply with the rules and the law, as it has always been?
Secretary of State.
I'd suggest to the honourable lady that after this session she reviews Hansard.
Melanie Ward.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Following the welcome clarity from the Supreme Court that Labour's Equality Act has always contained the right to single-sex spaces for women, as well as protections for trans people, does the Secretary of State agree that the SNP Scottish Health Secretary must urgently get a grip and ensure the NHS is upholding the law, especially in my area of Fife, where it appears that a nurse, Sandy Peggy, was disciplined by NHS managers for trying to access her right to use a single-sex changing room?
Secretary of State.
My honourable friend will understand that I'm not in a position to comment on ongoing cases, but what I can say to her is that I agree that the Supreme Court ruling demonstrated that the Equality Act that the last Labour government introduced is the basis on which single-sex provision based on biological sex should be delivered.
Tom Gordon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State says that the ruling provides clarity, but with trans constituents that I met and corresponded with over the weekend, it provides anxiety and fear. A local media outlet, The Stray Ferret, last week published an article documenting a 60% increase in trans hate crime in the last decade in North Yorkshire alone. I and many others worry that the rhetoric and language around this issue will only fuel that. So can the Secretary of State confirm how the government will ensure trans people, who are already disproportionately targeted, are not marginalised further, and that the upcoming EHRC guidance addresses the safety and inclusion as seriously as it does the legal clarity?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the ruling from the Supreme Court was clear, but he is right that there can be no place for hate and no place for people to be targeted on that basis, and it is important that action is taken against those who perpetrate hate crime.
Mayor Ellis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Like many of my colleagues today, I am truly exhausted by the cynicism of the culture wars around this topic, and I hope we can focus on how we make any changes work practically. Would the Secretary of State agree with me that all of us in this House should be mindful that there are human beings affected by every comment we make on this matter, and how we behave here will inform how the wider public behave, which I hope would be with kindness and compassion?
I I agree, Madam Deputy Speaker, that everyone in our society should be treated with dignity, with compassion and respect. And the Supreme Court ruling, while setting out its position on biological sex, was also clear that trans people retain important protections in law, including where it applies to discrimination and harassment. And I do believe it is important, Madam Deputy Speaker, that all of us share that message in understanding the ruling and in making sure that it is well understood across our country, because the last thing that any of us would want is for trans people to be fearful. That's right.
Houghton.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want everyone treated with dignity and respect, as the Supreme Court made clear. But should women have to rely on a court ruling followed by guidance at some point from the EHRC rather than the clear view of this House? And what would the Government's view be of primary legislation in this area rather than relying on a court ruling?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the ruling of the Supreme Court was that the Equality Act, which was passed by this House, is the basis for the protections that exist in law on the basis of biological sex.
Toby Perkins.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've had very constructive discussions with constituents on both sides of this debate. But does the Secretary of State agree with me that those who seek to promote trans rights with sexually aggressive placards or through aggressively threatening women who disagree with them in the most disgusting ways, as we've all seen, do tremendous harm to the trans cause and should realise how counterproductive their slogans are to the cause that they're attempting to promote?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, no one should be targeted through the use of vile placards containing abuse or hate, and he is absolutely right. I agree with him. Not only is that wrong, but as he says, it is completely counterproductive. It does nothing to advance the discussion that those who present those placards would wish. And it is important, whilst I understand that people have strong opinions in this area, that through any discussion or any debate, that does not take us to hate-filled rhetoric, threats of violence or intimidation.
Neil O'Brien.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State says that her position on these issues is very clear and hasn't changed at all over the years, and she's promising to work at pace now. And yet, 9 months into her time as Education Secretary, the guidance that was consulted on over a year ago has still not been published on gender questioning children. So can the Secretary of State help schools by answering this question? Can it ever be right for a school to socially transition a child without talking to the parents first?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, we will set out guidance this year for gender questioning children. It is important because I will answer the question. I will answer the question directly if the Right Honourable Lady would just allow me a moment. We will publish the guidance later this year. I recognise the importance of providing clarity to school leaders, and we inherited a draft version that it was important we looked at and engaged with stakeholders following the final review of the final CAS review. But yes, I do agree that it is important that parents are involved in important decisions about their children's lives. There will always, alongside that, be potential safeguarding considerations that also need to be taken into account. That's why we are looking at these areas very carefully to make sure that we get that right and we provide the clarity that school leaders, quite rightly, are asking for.
Chris Ward.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State is absolutely right that we need to conduct this debate with respect and compassion. Excuse me, because ultimately this is about people's lives and their rights. And that's why there is such concern in the trans community at the moment, including in my Brighton Kemp Town constituency, which has the largest trans community in the country. So can she confirm two things for me? First, how will she ensure that trans people have faith that their existing legal protections will be upheld and not rolled back on? And secondly, how will the government ensure that trans voices are heard as public bodies roll out their response to this ruling?
Secretary of State.
On the two areas that my right honourable friend asks, yes, absolutely. The trans people retain important protections in law, and the ruling of the Supreme Court puts that beyond doubt. Secondly, to the question he asks around ensuring that trans voices are heard, it will be important that the EHRC, as part of their consultation in developing the code of practice that will be required to provide further clarity, engage with a range of voices as a part of that, and I'm confident that will happen.
Jim Allister.
Given that Article 2 of the Windsor Framework ridiculously requires Northern Ireland to be in dynamic alignment with EU equality directives, which include embracing self-identification. What steps will the government take to ensure that this common sense ruling of the Supreme Court is applied consistently and without adulteration across the whole United Kingdom, now and always?
I will review the questions that the Honourable Gentleman asks and write to him with a full response.
Tom Hayes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Supreme Court asked that politicians not weaponise their interpretation of law set down by Parliament. It's almost like they had anticipated the Leader of the Opposition. Yeah. The public are watching, and wherever they stand on this debate, they are not seeing a potential Prime Minister in the Leader of the Opposition. Because trans people are worried and they are scared, it's important to give reassurance. The Supreme Court clearly said that trans people remain protected under the Equality Act, regardless of whether they have a gender recognition certificate. The Supreme Court said that it could not rule on the definition of a woman other than its use in the Equality Act. As I say, my constituents, who are trans, and their allies are deeply scared. Will the Secretary of State stand at the dispatch box and repeat her support for trans people in my constituency and around our country? And I want to repeat the invitation from my honourable friend, the member for Mid Dorset North Pool. At my invitation, young trans people from Bournemouth and Dorset are coming to this place to know that this is their parliament, that they have a place here. They are listened to and respected and have dignity. Would she or a minister come and meet with them?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'll review the request that my honourable friend makes, if he could provide me with additional details so that I can do that. But I do agree with him about the importance of reassurance that trans people should be free to live their lives with compassion, with dignity and respect, and the ruling of the Supreme Court made that very clear, that they retain legal protections, and it is important that we all convey that.
Graham Stewart.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for her statement and her emphasis on the need for sensitivity and indeed good temper in dealing with this topic. And in that spirit, could I ask her to salute the courage of J.K. Rowling, Sharon Davis, and indeed the Honourable Member for Canterbury?
Madam Deputy Speaker, over many decades, fantastic women have campaigned for the protection and creation of single-sex spaces, have fought against violence against women and girls, have led some brilliant campaigns, and I pay tribute to all of those women, many of them unsung heroes whose names we'll never hear anywhere and whose names will never be mentioned in this chamber, for their fantastic campaigning efforts. It is only because of the amazing work of feminists from the 1970s onwards, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we have rape crisis centres and women's refuges.
Tracy Gilbert.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I welcome the statement made by the Secretary of State. And I want to put on record my thanks to For Women Scotland for their tireless work over a number of years, where they were the public face of many women who have experienced discrimination, abuse and personal loss for making the argument that the Supreme Court made last Wednesday. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Supreme Court held up the rights of lesbians to be able to associate with same-sex attracted women. What steps is my right honourable friend taking to ensure that lesbians and gay men are able to associate without face of challenge?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Supreme Court ruling makes that clear and provides the clarity that many have been asking for, including lesbians and gay men, and the EHRC Statutory Code of Practice will provide further clarity. But I agree with my honourable friend, no one should have faced abuse or intimidation or harassment for expressing their legitimately held opinions.
Sammy Wilson.
While the Scottish National Party may see this as a judgment made by judicial bigots, most people will see this as a decision of common sense and will indeed wonder why the courts had to decide what was a man and what was a woman. But given the intolerant, threatening and violent response from the trans lobby, can the Minister assure us that this judgment will not be undermined by the guidance which she issues to this House, and that vulnerable people, sports teams, hospital patients, teachers, children will be protected by this and not be adversely affected as they have been in the past? And can she also give us assurance that she will ensure that it is raised at the highest level of government that Northern Ireland must be included in these protections?
Secretary of State.
The Supreme Court judgment was clear and is welcome and necessary, but what it also set out was that the basis for that protection for single-sex spaces is rooted in the Equality Act. So those provisions were always there, but now we have the clarity that many have been calling for. Whilst I note his understandable concern about the behaviour of a minority that crosses a line into conduct that is potentially criminal and certainly unacceptable, I think we do need to tread with just a bit of care, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we don't lump everyone into that category. I'm sure that wasn't the Honourable Gentleman's intention, setting out that whilst there can be no place for intimidation or threats of violence, people do have the right to express their opinions in line with our long-standing rights in terms of freedom of speech.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Equality Act is a vital piece of legislation that's there to protect the essential rights of oppressed groups, including women and of trans people, in a world still far too dominated by sexism and bigotry, including transphobia. I used the Equality Act plenty of times to represent people as a lawyer before I came into this place. The House will no doubt discuss the impact of the recent court judgment again, but when we look online and in some of the media, can we try to ensure that debate respects all groups, including trans people, because some of the stuff spilling out of the right-wing press and online in recent days is truly, truly awful. And it's been raised with me by trans constituents who are just trying to get on with their lives.
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Equality Act was one of the last Labour government's proudest achievements in ensuring that people are able to live their lives free from discrimination and prejudice and harassment. So I agree with him that in recognising that important and landmark piece of legislation, we ensure that when we discuss what are can be difficult and sensitive issues for some, we seek to do so in understanding that, as he says, people just simply want to get on and live their lives free from discrimination, harassment and abuse.
Cocking.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In 2022, sitting at Wormley Community Centre doing telling at the local elections, a woman came out after she had just voted and said, "I've just voted Conservative because you're the only party that knows what a woman is." So the British people really do care about this. So can the Minister be more specific on a time when she will issue guidance to schools about gender questioning children?
State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I've already said on a number of occasions in this House, we will be issuing that guidance this year.
Tristan Osborne.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I welcome the clarification and statement by my right honourable friend? I think the way she's reasonably dealt with questions in the House today is testament to her fortitude and her ability. Can I ask a number of different groups in my constituency who made representation, Hilary Cook from Medway Pride and women's advocacy groups, there is a worry around some of the elements around harassment and discrimination that some might take an opportunity to target the trans community. Can she guarantee this afternoon that the Labour Equality Act stands and prevents abuse, harassment against and discrimination?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Equality Act does stand and it provides clear protections within law for women and for trans people too. It is important that women have access to single-sex spaces such as women's refuges and rape crisis centres, but it is also important, of course, that trans people have access to high-quality healthcare and appropriate support services too, and in addition to that, the ability to see the police take action against hate crime.
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. A man is a man and a woman is a woman. And anybody watching this at home today will think that the lunatics have taken over the asylum, which they quite clearly have. Now, I don't need a Supreme Court judgment or ruling to tell me that a bloke shouldn't be in a women's changing room. So I want to ask the Secretary of State a very simple question for more clarity. Can a woman have a penis?
I tell you what, blokes shouldn't beat up women. Maybe he should have a word with his colleague.
James Asser.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State will not be surprised to hear that I've had a lot of correspondence on this, and there is great concern amongst the trans community what the impact is, but also the wider LGBT community, that in this populist age it may signal a move away from the progress on LGBT rights. I welcome, therefore, her statement that there is going to be guidance. Can she make sure that is very clear and widely distributed so it is understood? But can she also assure the LGBT community and this House that this government and this party, as it long has, stands foursquare behind the advancement of LGBT rights, and we will defend any attempt to roll back the progress of the last 30 years or the gains of the last Labour government?
Secretary of State. Madam Deputy Speaker, my humble friend is right to draw attention to the advances made over many decades to ensure that LGBT people are treated with dignity and have the support and ability to participate in public life that, frankly, for many people from many, many years ago was just simply not the case. We have made enormous progress in tackling prejudice and discrimination, and this Labour government will always ensure that whatever someone's background, they have every opportunity to take part in public life, to achieve all that they are capable of. And the Equality Act, one of the proudest achievements of that last Labour government, enshrines in law the right to freedom from discrimination and harassment for women, and yes, also for trans people too.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State very much for her answers and her statement. This ends years of confusion around sex-based protections. Being a woman is a matter of biology, not identity, and certainly not paperwork. This judgment is welcomed by women and children, and I believe many others. And does the Secretary of State not agree that this is not an eradication of rights for any person in this United Kingdom, but is an underlining of protection? And what discussions will take place with Cabinet colleagues to see an end, for example, posters for birthing people terminology and other such phrases being used in the NHS, and instead return to the court-declared definition of women through health trusts in this UK? Today is a good day for women, a great day for the law, and a wonderful day for the people and for truth.
I agree that the ruling of the Supreme Court was clear. That is important. It provides welcome clarity in a range of areas. And where it comes to the issues that he identifies, for example, around access to healthcare treatment, it is for a very good reason that we make sure that there are sex-based services available for women, for example, those who are breastfeeding, those who are going through pregnancy, and much more besides. But we also, alongside that, need to make sure that healthcare is available and accessible to all.
Jonathan Hinder.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've made so much progress as a society in breaking down sexist stereotyping. The stereotypes which said women had set roles, should look and act in a certain way, they were being broken down, exposed as the fake construct they really are. Because sex is the only factor which distinguishes men from women. Beyond that, you should be able to live without conforming to those stereotypes. But then this movement came along which argued, actually, all those feminine, girly things, those sexist stereotypes we'd been fighting to break down, they're in fact the things which make a woman, not sex. Regressive, backward, nonsensical. So will the Secretary of State join me in saluting those courageous women who stood up and pointed out the absurdity of this argument and commit to rooting out this ideology from our public institutions?
Madam Deputy Speaker, it was over many decades that feminist campaigners from the 70s onwards worked incredibly hard to ensure that women were able to divorce, that when that happened they were able to see their children, that they got protection at work, that they didn't face discrimination, that they could access women's refuges, rape crisis centres, and that rape was finally, back in the early 90s, banned in marriage. I pay tribute to the amazing feminist campaigners and women over many decades who have brought us to a much stronger position, and to the brilliant trailblazers from across political parties who have ensured that we have far more women represented here now in this place than ever before.
Peter Swallow.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Dignity and respect for all, those are the values that lift us up and set us free. Those are the values that define and distinguish any modern and compassionate society. I want to thank the Secretary of State for those remarks in her statement today. Will she just reiterate one more time that when this government talks about increasing, supporting equality for all, that really does mean all?
Madam Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend is right. This is about dignity and compassion for all, and that is an important message I think we should all take out from this House.
The final question from the backbench is David Smith.
you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for her clear and positive response to the Supreme Court's ruling. I, like her, before I was elected into this place, ran a North East based homelessness charity for 8 years. And I have to say, contrary to some of the debate in the last few days, and actually even in this place today, it is almost always possible to find a solution where you can support people on a single-sex basis and those who identify as transgender. So, and I have to add, I should say, Madam Deputy Speaker, that was the last 8 years that I did that was not helped by the total lack of clarity by the government, the Conservative government that was. So does the Secretary of State agree with me that it is important to reaffirm that under the Equality Act, trans people remain protected from discrimination under the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, and that the Supreme Court ruling is focused on clarifying protections that have always existed in the Equality Act based on the protected characteristic of sex?
He is right, Madam Deputy Speaker, in his assessment, and I pay tribute to the work that my honourable friend did over many years where it comes to supporting homeless young people and homeless people across the North East. I agree with him that it has always been possible to ensure that single-sex spaces were delivered on the basis of biological sex under the Equality Act, but I am glad that providers can now be absolutely confident and crystal clear. But one thing I would just observe in addition is that those rights were hard-fought and hard-won and received significant pushback over many periods of time. He will have doubtless had the same experience that I had, where commissioners would suggest that mixed-sex accommodation was appropriate, where in many cases we were talking about vulnerable young women who had been exposed to sexual violence, including sexual abuse within the home, and what they wanted and what they needed was single-sex accommodation. And it is important in that context that we ensure that services are available in an appropriate manner for anyone who needs them. And that does mean that on occasion, trans people will also require separate provision so that their needs can be properly met, their healthcare needs, their support needs, and where they may be facing abuse and intimidation.
That concludes the statement, and before we move on to the next statement, I'll just give a few moments for the front benches to swap over.